At 52, Daniel Mercer sat alone inside a silent combine on his 240-acre wheat farm outside Red Creek, Kansas, staring at numbers that told him what his eyes had already known for weeks. The harvest had failed. Drought had starved the wheat, brutal heat had weakened what survived, and a late storm had flattened sections of the crop just before harvest. After fuel repairs, seed debt, insurance, and the bills he could no longer postpone, Daniel counted what remained between his checking account and the cash in his wallet: $47. That was it. 4 years after losing his wife Laura, and with his daughter Emily living hours away in Wichita, the farm his family had worked for 3 generations was now one bad decision away from disappearing. When people around Red Creek learned Daniel was still talking about planting again, some shook their heads, others laughed, and one farmer told him that $47 wouldn't plant enough wheat to feed the birds. Even Emily begged him to stop before the farm took everything he had left. But Daniel couldn't walk away yet. Then, while comparing the miserable yield from different sections of his land, he noticed something strange. Nearly the entire farm had failed, except for a small 12-acre stretch along the northern field. The wheat there had grown through the same drought, endured the same heat, and faced the same storm, yet its grain was noticeably heavier. Daniel knelt in the stubble, pushed his fingers into the earth, and felt something the surrounding fields no longer held moisture. That evening, searching through old farm records for an explanation, he opened a weathered field notebook that had belonged to his father, Henry. Buried among decades of planting dates and rainfall totals was a short sentence written after another terrible dry year. Daniel read it once, then again, because it challenged almost everything he had been doing with the farm, with only $47 left, a failing grain drill in the barn, and no money to plant 240 acres again. Daniel suddenly realized he might never have needed to save all 240. He only needed enough seed for one small piece of ground, and the courage to try something his neighbors thought was already doomed. What happened when Daniel planted that one final crop would change the way he understood his land, his father's legacy, and what it actually meant to save a family farm. But before we see what he discovered in those 12 acres, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now, whether you're starting your morning, working through the afternoon, or listening late at night. I hope you have a peaceful and wonderful day ahead. And if you enjoy emotional stories about ordinary people facing impossible odds, rebuilding after failure, and finding one last reason to keep going, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story. Now, let's return to Red Creek, where a broke 52-year-old farmer was standing in a ruined wheat field with just $47 left and had just realized the ground beneath his boots was telling him something he had ignored for years. Daniel Mercer knew the harvest was failing before the combine monitor confirmed it. The grain tank was filling too slowly, the wheat heads were too light, and every pass across the field left him with less than half the yield he had counted on. At 52, Daniel had harvested wheat on Mercer Wheat Farm for most of his life, but he had never seen 240 acres look this tired. Months of drought had hardened the soil. Then, a brutal stretch of heat arrived at exactly the wrong time, shrinking kernels before they could fill. A late storm had come after the damage was done, flattening parts of the field instead of saving them. Daniel kept driving anyway. Every hour burned diesel he could barely afford, but leaving grain standing would be worse. Near the end of the afternoon, Sam Ortega pulled his pickup beside the field and waited until Daniel stopped the combine. Sam climbed onto the ladder and looked through the cab window. How bad? Daniel glanced at the yield monitor. Bad enough. Sam studied the field without saying more. He had farmed long enough to recognize defeat when it was still standing upright. "You finishing tonight?" "I'm finishing all of it. Might cost more in fuel than some of those acres are worth." Daniel looked back across the rows. "I know." Sam nodded once and climbed down. Daniel resumed cutting. The cab grew hot despite the air conditioning. And for a moment he remembered Laura bringing coffee to the edge of the field during harvest. She used to wave both arms until he noticed her. 4 years had passed since she died. But harvest was when her absence felt sharpest. There was no truck waiting with coffee now. No light in the kitchen he was driving toward. Only the hum of the combine and wheat pouring too slowly into the tank. After sunset, Daniel parked beside the barn and went inside with a legal pad. He added the numbers he had been avoiding: fuel, combine repair, seed account, insurance, loan payment. The grain he had harvested would cover some of it, but not enough. He crossed out one estimate and tried again. The result barely changed. Daniel opened his banking app, then counted the cash in his wallet. After the bills that could not wait, the amount he could actually use was $47. He stared at the number. $47 would not buy enough diesel for another long day. It would not buy meaningful seed. It would not fix anything that broke. His phone rang. Emily. Daniel let it ring once before answering. "Hey." "Dad? How's harvest?" He looked through the barn door toward the dark field. "Could have been worse." The lie came easily because he had used versions of it for months. "That doesn't sound good." "Just a dry year. Do you need anything?" "No, I'm fine." There was a pause long enough to tell him she did not believe him. "Call me if that changes." "I will." He ended the call and sat in silence the next morning. Daniel climbed back into the combine and finished the last acres. When the final pass ended, he stopped at the edge of the field instead of driving straight to the barn. Stubble stretched in every direction, pale and thin beneath the Kansas sky. This land had supported his grandfather, then Henry, then Daniel. He had always assumed that if he worked hard enough, there would be another planting after every harvest. For the first time, that assumption was gone. Daniel looked at the empty grain tank, then at the $47 written on the folded paper in his pocket. He had enough land for another season. He did not have enough money to plant it. The banker did not say no immediately, which somehow made the answer harder for Daniel to hear. He sat across from Mr. Keller's desk the morning after harvest, while the banker worked through the farm's numbers twice. "Your equity is still here," Keller finally said, "but cash flow is the problem. After this harvest, I can't approve another operating loan without additional collateral or a plan showing how next season improves." Daniel looked through the window toward Main Street. "The land is the collateral. Most of it already supports existing debt." Keller folded his hands. "Selling acreage would give you room. I'm not selling the farm." "Then bring me a different plan." Daniel drove home with the same $47 and one more problem he could not repair with a wrench. Emily's car was parked beside the house when he arrived. She had driven from Wichita after realizing something was wrong during their phone call. Daniel found her at the kitchen table with his legal pad. "You went through my bills. You left them out. That doesn't make them yours." Emily pushed the paper toward him. "Dad, you told me it was a dry year. You didn't tell me you can't afford to plant." "I'll figure something out. With $47, he hated hearing the number in her voice. "The bank said no." "Didn't they?" Daniel did not answer. Emily's expression softened. "Sell some of the land?" "No." "Then lease it, reduce the farm." "Do something before the bank makes the decision for you. This farm has been in our family for 3 generations, and that doesn't mean you have to die trying to keep every acre." Daniel stood. "Your grandfather kept it through worse. Grandpa had grandma. You had mom. Who do you have here now?" The question landed harder than she intended. Emily immediately looked away. Dad. Mom wouldn't want you dying with this place. Daniel's chair scraped against the floor. Don't use your mother to tell me to sell her home. I'm trying to keep my father. Neither spoke. Emily picked up her keys a few minutes later. Before leaving, she said quietly, I'm not asking you to forget Mom. Daniel watched her car disappear down the county road and wished he had known how to answer. That afternoon, Sam Ortega found him walking the harvested field. Sam carried a soil probe and stopped near the southern section where the wheat had performed worst. He pushed the probe down, examined the dry core, then moved north. You plant all this at the same rate? Mostly. Same timing. It's one wheat farm. Sam gave him a sideways look. Land doesn't care what you call it. They crossed a shallow rise toward the northern field. Daniel noticed the stubble there was thicker. He had seen it from the combine but dismissed it as normal variation. Sam pushed the probe into the soil and pulled out a darker core. More moisture. Daniel crouched and broke the soil between his fingers. It was not wet, but it held together instead of crumbling immediately. This section always holds better. How'd it yield? Daniel thought back to the monitor. Better than south. How much better? They checked the harvest records in the combine. The difference was unmistakable. The northern section had still produced a poor crop, but it had outperformed much of the farm. Sam looked across the 240 acres. You've been treating different ground like it's identical. My father planted the whole place. Your father farmed his weather. You're farming yours. Daniel bristled. You saying Henry didn't know this land? I'm saying Henry watched it. You're the one turning what he did into commandments. Daniel said nothing. Sam handed back the yield records. More acres don't mean a better farmer. Easy to say when you're not the one deciding what gets abandoned. Who said anything about abandoning it? Sam walked back toward his truck. Daniel remained near the northern section. He knelt again and pushed his fingers into the soil. Moisture lingered beneath the surface, while the ground farther south had turned powder dry. For 3 generations, the Mercers had measured survival partly by how much land they could keep planted. Daniel had spent the morning believing his choices were to finance all 240 acres or lose the farm. Now he looked at the stronger stubble beneath his boots and considered a question that felt almost like betrayal. If he could not afford to plant 240 acres, why was he still assuming that he had to? Daniel carried the $47 into Calder Farm Supply folded inside his wallet, as if keeping the bills together might make them worth more. Ruth Calder was stacking work gloves behind the counter when he entered. She had known Daniel since before he married Laura, which meant there was no convincing her he had stopped by casually. What do you need? She asked. Wheat seed. Ruth glanced toward the loading area. How much? Daniel placed 2 20s, a 5, and 2 1s on the counter. That much? Ruth stared at the money, then at him. Daniel, I'm serious. $47 won't seed a farm. I'm not seeding the farm. He explained what Sam had found in the northern field and showed her the yield figures. He wanted enough seed for 12 acres, nothing more. Ruth took out a calculator. Even at that scale, normal certified seed exceeded his cash. What about leftovers? Daniel asked. Canceled orders, torn bags, anything usable that nobody wants? I'm not selling you bad seed. I didn't ask for bad seed. Ruth disappeared into the storage room and returned with an inventory sheet. A customer had canceled part of an order, leaving a small lot of wheat seed she had not expected to move. It was sound, but even the smallest practical quantity cost more than Daniel had. Ruth tapped the figure. I can hold it. Holding it doesn't help me plant it. I could extend credit. Daniel shook his head. I already owe enough people. They recalculated until Ruth found a quantity Daniel could afford while leaving a few dollars for diesel. It was less seed than he wanted. He would have to tighten every other decision around it. When Ruth handed him the receipt, she did not wish him luck. "Plant where the moisture is," she said, "not where your pride is." Daniel loaded the seed into his pickup. Emily called before he left town. He considered ignoring it, then answered. "Sam told me you're planning to plant again," she said. Daniel frowned. "Apparently Red Creek has developed an emergency broadcasting system." 12 acres. Dad, that's the plan. With $47, part of it. That sounds desperate. Daniel looked through the windshield at the seed in the truck bed. "It is." Emily went quiet. "But desperate and pointless aren't the same thing, and if it fails," Daniel had no reassuring answer. "Then I lose 12 acres of seed instead of borrowing enough to gamble on 240. Emily exhaled. "I still think you should sell enough land to breathe." "I know, but I need to see what those 12 acres can do." She did not agree, but this time they ended the call without fighting. Back at Mercer Wheat Farm, Daniel carried the seed into the barn and turned toward the grain drill. The machine had belonged to Henry before him. It was old, narrow, and ugly enough that Daniel had joked for years that rust was part of its factory paint. He hitched it to the tractor and began checking the openers, hoses, and seed cups. 12 acres did not require beautiful equipment. It required equipment that moved. He pulled forward. The drill traveled several yards before a sharp grinding sound came from the left side. Daniel stopped immediately. He climbed down, crouched beside the wheel assembly, and found the problem. The bearing had failed. He removed the housing and stared at the damaged pieces in his palm. Under ordinary circumstances, it was an irritating repair. Under these circumstances, it might as well have been an engine. Daniel checked the shelves in the workshop for an old replacement. Nothing matched. He searched drawers Henry had labeled decades earlier: bolts, washers, chain links, grease fittings. No bearing. He called the nearest parts counter and gave them the number stamped into the housing. The clerk found one. Daniel asked the price, listened, and closed his eyes. "Thanks," he said before hanging up. He could not buy it and still have enough diesel to plant. For several minutes he stood beside the drill while late sunlight entered through the barn doors. Behind him sat the small amount of seed he had spent nearly everything he could spare to obtain. Beyond the barn waited 12 acres that still held more moisture than the rest of the farm, for the first time since harvest. Daniel had made a plan small enough to afford. Now a single worn piece of metal had stopped it before one kernel reached the ground. He opened his hand and looked at the broken bearing. The seed was ready. The field was ready. Daniel simply had no working machine left to put one into the other. Daniel left the broken bearing on the workbench overnight, but by sunrise it had not become any cheaper. He called 2 more parts suppliers anyway. One had the bearing in stock. The other could order it by afternoon. Both wanted more than Daniel could spend without using the few dollars he had reserved for diesel. He stood beside the grain drill, staring at the seed stacked against the barn wall. 12 acres had seemed like a practical compromise. Now even 12 felt beyond reach. His phone was already in his hand when he stopped himself. He could call Emily. She had offered help without actually saying the words. But Daniel knew exactly what would happen. She would send money, he would accept it because there was no alternative, and this experiment would begin with another debt he could not emotionally repay. Instead, he called Sam Ortega. "You busy?" Daniel asked. Farmer asking another farmer that question during planting season? Sam replied. "What broke?" 20 minutes later, Sam was kneeling beside the drill. He removed the damaged bearing, wiped grease from the housing, and studied the stamped number. "I might have something." Might. That means don't get excited. They drove to Sam's farm and entered a machinery shed crowded with equipment accumulated across decades. Against the rear wall sat an old implement Daniel barely recognized beneath dust and rust. Sam removed a wheel assembly and exposed its bearing. "Same inside diameter," he said. "Housing's different." Daniel measured it. Bearing itself might work. They pressed it free on Sam's workbench. The part was worn but smooth. Daniel rotated it between his fingers. "What do you want for it?" "Nothing." "I'm not taking it for nothing." "Then pay me when something grows." Daniel looked at him. Sam shrugged. "If nothing grows, I saved you from paying for a used bearing." Back at Mercer Wheat Farm, they spent most of the afternoon fitting the part, cleaning the housing, adjusting the chain, and greasing every point Daniel had neglected while concentrating on bigger problems. When they finally pulled the drill forward, the wheel turned cleanly. Daniel listened for grinding. Nothing. "There," Sam said. "Now you only have weather, money, and farming to worry about." After Sam left, Daniel went into the farmhouse looking for Henry Mercer's old field records. He found them in a cabinet beneath tax documents and machinery manuals, narrow notebooks with years written across their covers. Henry had recorded rainfall, planting dates, seed varieties, freezes, breakdowns, and yields in cramped pencil. Daniel had seen the notebooks before, but had never read them closely. He opened one from a drought year he remembered from childhood. Henry had planted later on some fields and shallower on others. In another year, he had reduced acreage after poor rainfall. Daniel frowned. His father had not farmed the same way every season. Daniel had remembered the routines but forgotten the adjustments. Near the bottom of one page, Henry had underlined a sentence: "Don't chase acreage. Chase moisture." Daniel sat back. Sam's words returned to him. "Your father farmed his weather. You're farming yours." For years, Daniel had defended planting all 240 acres, as if changing the pattern would disrespect Henry. Yet Henry himself had changed whenever the land demanded it. Daniel had inherited his father's methods and somehow turned them into rules his father had never followed. Before dawn the next morning, he carried the notebook into the tractor cab. The northern 12 acres had retained moisture better than the rest of the farm, but conditions were still dry. Daniel checked the soil at several points before setting the drill. Instead of automatically using the depth and timing he had relied on for years, he adjusted both to the moisture actually beneath him. Then he loaded the seed Ruth had sold him. There was no room for waste. He calibrated the drill twice. Sam arrived as Daniel was finishing. "You waiting for permission?" Sam asked. Daniel looked across the 12 acres. Beyond them stretched more than 200 acres he could not afford to plant. For the first time, he tried not to see those acres as failure. "No," he said. "Just making sure I'm listening." He lowered the drill and started forward. Seed disappeared into narrow openings in the earth. Pass by pass, the small field changed behind him. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no sudden rain, no certainty that he had made the right decision. There was only an old tractor, a repaired bearing, a few bags of seed, and 12 acres receiving one more chance. By sunset, Daniel finished the final pass. He climbed down and stood in the field, exhausted but calmer than he had felt since harvest. He checked the forecast on his phone. For 3 days, it had shown rain approaching Red Creek. That rain was the reason Daniel had planted when he did. The forecast refreshed. The rain symbol disappeared. Daniel checked the next day. Clear. The day after that? Clear. He scrolled through the entire forecast. Nothing beneath his boots. The last seed he could afford was sitting in dry Kansas soil, and the rain Daniel had counted on was no longer coming. For the next 4 mornings, Daniel walked the northern 12 acres before breakfast. He carried a pocket knife, a small trowel, and Henry's old notebook. Though there was almost nothing to record except another day without rain. Each morning he scraped away the top layer of soil and checked beneath it. The moisture he had planted into was disappearing. The seed remained underground, waiting. By the 5th day, Daniel could crumble the upper soil between his fingers like flour. He checked the forecast again. 10% chance of rain, then 20. By afternoon, it had fallen back to 10. He put the phone away. Watching percentages change was beginning to feel like watching money disappear. Emily called that evening. "How's the 12 acres?" "Still 12 acres of dirt." "Did it rain?" "No." Silence followed. Then she asked, "Do you need money?" Daniel looked through the kitchen window toward the field. His first instinct was the same one he had followed for years. Say no, say everything was fine, protect his daughter from the problem. "The farm's in trouble, Saying it aloud felt worse than seeing $47 on paper. "How much trouble?" "Enough that if this crop fails, I don't have another planting plan." Emily was quiet. "Then let me help." "Not yet, Dad. I'm not pretending anymore. I'm just asking you to let me try this first." Her voice softened. "Okay, but don't disappear into it." The next morning, Ruth Calder's pickup appeared beside the field. She walked out carrying a soil probe. "You planning to stare the wheat into germinating? It's cheaper than irrigation." Ruth checked several spots. Some seeds had begun absorbing moisture, but emergence remained uneven. Daniel mentioned buying more seed if the stand came up poorly. Ruth shook her head immediately. "Don't panic and plant twice. If half of it doesn't emerge, then we count what emerges before deciding anything." "You don't have money to solve anxiety with seed." Daniel disliked the sentence because it was accurate. 2 more dry days passed. He resisted digging repeatedly into the rows. Sam told him to leave the field alone. Ruth told him the same. Daniel listened, which felt surprisingly difficult. On the 9th evening, clouds gathered west of Red Creek. The weather report promised little. Daniel stood outside anyway. The first drops were widely spaced, darkening the dust without joining together. Then rain settled into a thin, steady pattern. It lasted less than an hour. Daniel placed an old gauge near the barn and checked it afterward. Not enough to replenish the soil, barely enough to matter. But the following afternoon, he found the first green shoot. Daniel crouched so quickly his knee struck the ground. A narrow blade had broken through the crust. Several feet away stood another, then another. By the next morning, faint green lines appeared across portions of the 12 acres. Emergence was not perfect. Some rows were thin, and the driest patches remained bare. Still, something had answered. Sam joined him near the edge of the field. "Don't start spending the harvest yet. I wasn't—" "You've got that look." Daniel smiled, despite himself. "What look?" "The one farmers get when something green appears and they immediately forget everything capable of killing it." Daniel looked across the small field. For weeks, every number had told him what he could no longer do. $47, 12 acres, 1 failed bearing, 1 nearly empty fuel budget. Now the smallest thing on the farm, a green shoot barely taller than his finger, felt larger than all of them. That evening, Daniel wrote the emergence date in Henry's notebook. Beneath it, he added, "Light rain, uneven stand, better in lower northern ground." He stopped before writing anything hopeful. The forecast changed before bedtime. A cold front was moving through Kansas faster than expected. Temperatures could fall below freezing before dawn. Daniel checked the wheat development notes Ruth had given him, then looked outside at the young plants. The crop had finally emerged, and now it would face its first real test before its roots had fully established. He slept badly. Before sunrise, Daniel pulled on his boots and stepped outside. The air had the hard, breathless cold of winter arriving early. His pickup windshield was white. Grass beside the house glittered beneath a thin crust. He drove to the northern field and stopped at the edge without turning off the engine. In the headlights, the 12 acres no longer looked green. Frost covered the rows from one end of the field to the other. Daniel did not step into the field until the sun had been up for nearly an hour. Frost still clung to the wheat, and he knew enough not to judge damage while the plants were frozen. He walked the edge instead, hands deep in his coat pockets, watching the white coating slowly disappear from the leaves. By mid-morning, some shoots had darkened and bent. Others remained upright. Daniel crouched beside one of the better rows and pressed his fingers into the soil around the crown. The leaves looked hurt, but the base of the plant was still firm. Sam arrived before noon and joined him without saying anything for several minutes. "You checking leaves or crowns?" he finally asked. "Crowns." "Good." They moved through the 12 acres together, sampling plants from higher ground, lower ground, and thinner patches. Some seedlings had clearly suffered. A few were dead, but most crowns remained alive beneath the surface. Sam pulled one plant carefully and split it near the base. Still green. Daniel let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. So it made it. It survived one cold morning. "Don't turn that into a victory speech." Daniel almost smiled. "You really know how to celebrate. That's why I'm still farming over the next several weeks." Daniel stopped treating the 12 acres like a miniature version of the old farm. He began treating it like 12 separate acres that happened to be connected. Every few days, he checked soil moisture at different points. He recorded morning temperature, wind exposure. Henry's old notebook stayed on the kitchen table, but Daniel added his own pages instead of simply copying what his father had done. He wrote down where emergence had been weak and where the crop had recovered best after frost. He compared low spots with the shallow rise Sam had pointed out. The work was slower than farming by habit, but for the first time in years, Daniel felt as though he was looking at the land rather than merely repeating a schedule. Emily came home one Saturday carrying work gloves and groceries. "I'm not giving you money," she said before Daniel could object. "These are groceries." "That sounds suspiciously like giving me money in food form." "Then consider it payment for making me worry." They spent the afternoon repairing a stretch of fence near the barn and clearing old machinery parts from one side of the shed. Emily found one of Laura's faded gardening gloves beneath a box of bolts. She held it up quietly. Daniel stopped working. "She used to leave those everywhere," he said. "Mom hated putting things back where they belonged. She claimed she knew exactly where everything was. She did not." Daniel laughed once, then sat on an overturned bucket. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Emily looked toward the farmhouse. "You know I'm not asking you to sell because I hate this place." "I know." "Do you?" Daniel looked at the field beyond the barn. "Maybe I didn't." He rubbed grease from his hands with a rag. "After your mom died, I kept everything the same fields, same rotation, same planting habits. I think I told myself that if the farm stayed exactly how she remembered it, then I hadn't lost all of it." Emily sat beside him. "Mom loved us. She didn't love a particular planting schedule." Daniel gave her a sideways look. "She did have opinions about planting. She had opinions about everything." That made them both laugh. The sound felt strange in the barn, but good. Emily stayed through Sunday. Before leaving, she walked the northern 12 acres with Daniel. The wheat was still uneven, but most of it had recovered from the frost. "It looks better than I expected," she admitted. "Me too." "That's not very reassuring." "Farming rarely is." After her car disappeared down the road, Daniel returned to the house and opened the mail he had ignored that morning. One envelope carried the lender's logo. Inside was a formal reminder about an upcoming payment due before harvest. Daniel read the amount twice. The crop might survive the winter, it might survive spring, it might even produce enough grain to prove his smaller plan could work. But none of that mattered if the farm ran out of time first. He set the notice beside Henry's notebook and looked through the window at the 12 acres holding on beneath the cold sky. For the first time, Daniel understood the next threat clearly. He did not only have to grow wheat, he had to keep the farm alive long enough to harvest it. Daniel spread every bill across the kitchen table and worked backward from the payment deadline. The amount due before harvest was more than the farm could produce in cash, and the 12 acres growing outside could not help him yet. Selling land would solve the problem fastest. Daniel knew that. He also knew he was not ready to cut pieces from Mercer Wheat Farm before discovering whether the small northern field could prove another way forward. So he walked through the machinery shed instead. There were implements he had not used in years. Equipment kept because Henry had owned it, and attachments meant for an operation larger than the one Daniel could currently afford. He photographed an old tillage implement, a spare trailer, and 2 attachments, then listed them for sale. The first buyer tried to bargain him down so far Daniel nearly sent him away. Then he remembered the payment notice on the kitchen table. He accepted a fairer second offer 2 days later. Emily drove down from Wichita that weekend and found him adding numbers. "You sold equipment?" she asked. "Things I don't need. That's different from what you would have said a month ago." Daniel looked at the empty space in the shed. "A month ago, I thought keeping the farm meant keeping everything." Emily sat beside him. And together, they made a budget based on what Daniel actually needed, rather than what the farm had traditionally carried. The combine stayed. The tractor stayed. The repaired grain drill stayed. Other machinery could go. Even after the sales, however, Daniel remained short of the payment. Sam supplied the next possibility. He met Daniel beside the unplanted acreage and pointed toward ground where grass had established between old stubble. "Let me graze cattle here short term." Daniel frowned. "That's wheat ground." "Not this year." "How much land?" Sam named an area that would not interfere with the 12-acre crop. "I pay you rent. My cattle get grass. Your empty acres earn something." Daniel stared across land his family had always expected to plant. Allowing cattle onto it felt strangely like admitting those acres no longer belonged to the farm he remembered. Sam seemed to read his hesitation. "You can preserve the picture in your head. Or you can preserve the farm," Daniel agreed. The grazing money, combined with the equipment sales, closed the immediate gap. When Emily updated the budget, she circled the result. "You can make the payment," Daniel nodded. "This one, you bought time. Until harvest? That's still time." Spring arrived with less rain than anyone wanted. The 12 acres emerged from winter uneven but alive. Then began showing stress as one promised storm after another missed Red Creek. Daniel had no irrigation system and no money to install one. He could only protect the moisture already in the soil. Instead of disturbing the ground because that was what he had once done automatically, he watched it. He checked moisture at different depths. He recorded wind exposure and temperature. He compared the shallow rise with the lower northern ground. Henry's notebook became less of an instruction manual and more of a conversation. Daniel still read his father's observations, but beneath them, he added his own. Sam joined him one afternoon as Daniel examined roots from a plant near the field edge. "Deeper than last year," Daniel said, "and the ground dry on top, better underneath." They walked farther into the field. The stand was thinner in several patches, but the established wheat looked stronger than the previous crop had at the same stage. "You still think 12 acres was desperation?" Sam asked. "It was desperation." Daniel pressed soil between his fingers. "I'm starting to think that doesn't mean it was wrong." Sam nodded. "There's a useful distinction. Daniel looked toward the unplanted acreage where Sam's cattle grazed in the distance. For months, he had seen those empty acres as evidence of everything he had lost. Now they looked different. They were helping make the payment. They were buying time without demanding seed, diesel, or another loan. More acres did not automatically mean more survival. The wheat continued developing. Daniel recorded jointing, moisture levels, and the first heads emerging. Each change gave him another piece of evidence. The northern field was not simply surviving because he had been lucky. He had chosen the ground that retained moisture. He had adjusted planting depth. He had concentrated limited seed instead of spreading resources across land he could not support. None of those choices guaranteed a harvest, but together they had produced a crop still standing. Emily called one evening while Daniel was walking the rows. "How's your 12-acre empire heading?" "I don't know what that means." "It means we're closer." "Closer to good?" Daniel smiled. "Closer to finding out." "You're impossible." "Wheat punishes confidence," Emily laughed. The sound stayed with him after they hung up. Daniel reached the end of the field and looked back. Green heads moved gently under the late spring wind. 12 acres seemed tiny against the rest of Mercer Wheat Farm, but for the first time Daniel did not measure their importance by size. His phone buzzed. A weather alert appeared across the screen. Daniel opened the extended forecast. A high-pressure system was moving into western Kansas. Temperatures would climb rapidly and remain dangerously high for nearly a week. 95, 98, 100. Daniel stopped walking. The previous harvest had been crippled when brutal heat arrived at almost this same stage, shrinking kernels before they could properly fill. He looked down at the stronger roots, then across the field whose remaining moisture had carried it this far. He had changed what he could change. He had listened to the soil. He had reduced the acreage. He had given the crop a better beginning. But the weather did not owe him a better ending. By the time Daniel reached the farmhouse, the first heat advisory had already been issued. The heat arrived before noon on Monday. By 2 o'clock, the thermometer outside Daniel's barn showed 97 degrees, and the wind moving across Mercer Wheat Farm felt as if it had passed through an oven. Daniel walked the northern 12 acres early before the worst of it, checking soil beneath the surface and studying the wheat heads. The plants were beginning the stage he feared most. Last year, heat at almost this exact point had interrupted grain filling and left him harvesting kernels that felt nearly hollow in his palm. By Tuesday, the temperature reached 100. Daniel pulled several plants and carried them into the shade. Some leaves had begun curling. The higher ground showed stress first. He opened a wheat head carefully and examined the developing kernels. They were still soft, still forming. "Come on," he whispered, although there was nothing he could do to make them fill faster. Sam arrived that evening. Together they checked moisture at several depths. The surface was powder dry, but farther down, the soil still held something. "Roots got down to it," Sam said. Daniel nodded. That was what he had hoped for when he changed the planting depth and concentrated on this ground. Hope, however, was not proof. Wednesday was worse. Daniel watched the field through shimmering heat and forced himself not to confuse visible stress with total failure. Some plants would suffer. Some yield was already being lost. Farming did not reward him for wanting a clean victory. By Thursday evening, the wheat was still standing. Friday brought 99 degrees. Then the high-pressure system finally began moving east. Daniel walked into the field at sunset. Several thin patches looked burned at their edges, and some heads were lighter than he wanted. But when he broke open samples from the stronger rows, the kernels were noticeably fuller than those he remembered from the failed harvest. Sam checked another head beside him. Not perfect, no, but not last year. Daniel rolled a kernel between his fingers. No, not last year. He did not celebrate. There were too many weeks between a living crop and grain in a truck. Still, the 12 acres had entered the hottest week with deeper roots and better stored moisture, and they had come through damaged rather than destroyed. Emily drove down from Wichita that weekend. Daniel found her standing at the edge of the northern field before she reached the house. The wheat had begun changing color, green slowly giving way to gold. "That's really it?" she asked. "All 12 acres. It looks bigger from here. Everything does when you've worried about every foot of it." They walked between the rows. Daniel showed her the weaker patches and then opened ahead from a healthier section. Emily held several kernels in her palm. "Are these good?" "Better. Better enough, ask me after the combine runs." She looked across the field for a long time. "Maybe you were right to plant it." Daniel shook his head. "I was wrong about almost everything before I planted it." Emily glanced at him. "That's a strange way to accept a compliment. I kept thinking saving the farm meant doing more of what I'd always done. More acres, more borrowing, same schedule, same assumptions." He rubbed a wheat head between his fingers. 12 acres only had a chance because I finally stopped doing that." Emily slipped her arm through his briefly. "Mom would have enjoyed hearing you admit you were wrong. She'd have written down the date." They laughed, and Daniel felt the old ache of Laura's absence without needing to push it away. That evening, he entered the week's observations in Henry's notebook. Heat damage on exposed ground. Better retention in lower section. Kernels filling. Stand holding. He closed the notebook and looked through the kitchen window. The crop was approaching harvest. For the first time, Daniel allowed himself to imagine the combine entering those 12 acres and the grain tank filling faster than it had the year before. His phone buzzed with a weather notification. He expected another heat report. Instead, a storm system was developing west of Red Creek. The forecast showed heavy rain, strong winds, and the possibility of severe thunderstorms arriving before the wheat would be ready to cut. Daniel enlarged the radar map. The projected path crossed directly over the farm. He remembered last year's late storm and the flattened wheat lying almost beyond the reach of the combine header. The 12 acres had survived drought, uncertain germination, frost, winter, financial pressure, a dry spring, and a week of punishing heat. Now, with harvest finally close enough to imagine? Daniel stood at the kitchen window watching dark clouds build on the western horizon. The storm reached Mercer Wheat Farm shortly after midnight. Daniel heard the first wind against the farmhouse before the rain began, and within minutes water was striking the windows hard enough to wake him completely. He dressed and stood on the porch, staring toward 12 acres he could no longer see. There was nothing to protect now, no adjustment to make, no machine to repair by dawn. The rain had passed east. Daniel drove to the northern field before making coffee. His stomach tightened when the wheat came into view. Along the western edge, several rows had lodged under the wind. Another patch near the shallow rise leaned heavily, but most of the field was still standing. Daniel stopped the pickup and walked through wet stubble, lifting heads and checking stems. The storm had taken something, but not everything. Sam arrived an hour later. "Could have been worse," he said. Daniel looked at him. "I used that line after the last harvest. Difference is this time it's true." They waited for the field to dry. Daniel checked grain moisture each day rather than rushing the combine onto wet ground. When conditions finally allowed harvest, Emily drove down from Wichita. She found Daniel servicing the combine beside the barn. "You nervous?" she asked. "No." "You've checked that belt 3 times." Daniel wiped his hands. 4. Sam arrived in his pickup just as Daniel climbed into the cab. Nobody made a speech. Daniel started the engine and drove toward the northern field. The sound brought him immediately back to the failed harvest, the slow grain tank, the weak numbers, the feeling of burning diesel to collect almost nothing. He lowered the header. Wheat disappeared beneath it for the first 100 yards. Daniel refused to look at the yield monitor. Then grain began striking the tank behind him with a sound he had almost forgotten. He looked. The number was higher than last year. Much higher. Daniel slowed, convinced something was wrong with the monitor. On the next pass, the reading held. He stopped and climbed down. Sam walked over from the field edge. "Problem? Check this." Daniel handed him a sample. Sam rubbed the grain between his palms, blew away the chaff, and studied the kernels. They were not extraordinary. They were simply full. Solid wheat, the kind Daniel had expected every year until the failed season taught him otherwise. "Keep cutting," Sam said. Daniel returned to the cab, pass after pass. The tank filled at a pace that made the previous harvest feel even more painful by comparison. The lodged section reduced the average, and the thin patches produced less. But the 12 acres still yielded well enough to confirm what Daniel had begun suspecting during spring. The smaller planting had worked. Emily waited beside the truck when Daniel finished unloading, so she asked. Daniel showed her the numbers. That's good, Emily smiled, and Daniel finally allowed himself to do the same. Good enough to save the farm. Daniel looked across the remaining 228 acres. Good enough to prove something. After the grain was sold, he returned to the kitchen table where the crisis had begun. He subtracted hauling costs, fuel, the remaining urgent obligations, and what he needed to reserve for seed. The harvest had not made him rich. It had not erased the farm's debt or restored everything lost the year before. But the numbers no longer ended at $47. He could meet the immediate obligations. He could keep enough working cash to prepare another crop. Most importantly, he had evidence that concentrating resources on suitable ground could produce better results than planting every acre simply because his family always had. Emily sat across from him while he finished the calculations. So does this mean the farm is saved? Daniel looked through the window. Sam's cattle still grazed acreage that would once have been wheat. Empty machinery spaces remained in the shed. 12 harvested acres lay golden beneath the evening light. The old version of Mercer Wheat Farm was already gone. For months, Daniel had treated that as defeat. Now he understood that trying to rebuild exactly what had failed would only bring him back to the same kitchen table. He closed Henry's notebook and rested his hand on its worn cover. "No," he said. Emily's smile faded slightly. Daniel looked toward the northern field. "It means we finally know how to start saving it." Daniel did not use the successful 12 acres as an excuse to return to the old farm. That was the first decision that proved he had actually learned something. At the kitchen table, he spread maps of all 240 acres beside Henry's notebook and marked the ground according to what the previous year had shown him. The northern acreage that held moisture best would remain in wheat. Other sections would enter rotation or stay available for short-term grazing rather than consuming seed and diesel simply because the Mercers had always planted them. Sam studied the plan one afternoon and tapped an unplanted section. "A year ago, leaving that out would have kept you awake." "A year ago, everything kept me awake. Progress." Daniel smiled. "Or exhaustion." The new arrangement reduced his costs enough to make the numbers believable. It was not a plan for getting rich. It was a plan for remaining a farmer when Daniel returned to Calder Farm Supply. Ruth looked toward his hands. "No $47 on my counter. Not today." This time Daniel ordered only the seed his plan required and arranged ordinary payment terms he could reasonably meet. Ruth handed him the paperwork. "You know, most people who survive one disaster immediately try to rebuild everything they lost. I thought about it, and I don't need the old farm back. I need this one to work. Emily remained in Wichita. Daniel never asked her to return permanently, and she never offered. Instead, she visited when she wanted to, called without every conversation becoming an argument, and helped with budgets when Daniel asked. The farm stopped being a test of whether she loved him enough to come home. One evening before planting, she sat with him on the porch while the last light stretched across the fields. "Does it feel strange?" she asked. "What, doing it differently?" Daniel considered the question. Yes, strange than losing it. After Emily left, Daniel opened Henry's notebook. He found the drought year page again and ran his thumb beneath his father's sentence. Don't chase acreage, chase moisture. For years, Daniel had treated Henry's farming methods as instructions carved in stone. Now he saw the sentence for what it really was: permission to pay attention. Beneath it, Daniel wrote his own line, and don't confuse changing with quitting. Planting began the following week. The repaired grain drill rattled behind the tractor, its borrowed bearings still turning. Daniel calibrated carefully, checked moisture, adjusted when conditions changed, and stopped measuring the value of a day by how many acres he covered. The season that followed was not easy. Several dry weeks tightened the soil. A machinery problem cost him half a day and more money than he wanted to spend. One forecast promised rain that never reached Red Creek. Another storm delivered barely enough to settle the dust. There were mornings when Daniel stood at the field edge, wondering whether the successful 12 acres had given him confidence he had not earned. But he did not respond by planting more ground, borrowing more money, or trying to force the farm back into its former shape. He watched, he recorded, he adjusted, the wheat held. By early summer, the heads were filling evenly across the ground Daniel had selected. Some sections were stronger than others. Nothing about the crop looked miraculous. That reassured Daniel more than perfection would have. When harvest finally arrived, Emily drove down from Wichita and found him preparing the combine. Sam was already nearby, checking one of his cattle fences before heading over. Daniel climbed into the cab alone. He started the engine and sat for a moment, with his hands resting on the controls. 1 year earlier, he had occupied this same seat while a failed harvest accumulated behind him, too slowly to pay for another season. He remembered the legal pad, the bills, the banking app, the cash in his wallet. $47. He remembered lying to Emily that harvest could have been worse because admitting the truth had felt more frightening than losing money. Then Daniel lowered the header. Wheat disappeared beneath the machine. Grain began striking the tank. The sound was steady. At the end of the first pass, Daniel checked the monitor. He did not grin or slap the steering wheel. He simply turned the combine and made another pass. The numbers held. By midday, the grain truck was waiting. Sam stood near it while Emily watched from the field edge. The yield was good. Not extraordinary. Not something that would make newspapers or turn Mercer Wheat Farm into a story about sudden wealth. It was simply a strong harvest produced by a farm finally operating within what its soil, weather, and finances could support. Daniel stopped the combine at the end of a row and shut off the header. For several seconds he listened to the engine idle. Then he looked behind him at the grain in the tank. A year ago, he had believed success meant restoring all 240 acres to what they had been. Now he had working capital. He had money reserved for seed. He had a manageable plan for the acreage. He had debt still to pay and equipment that would break again because that was farming. But he also had another season. Emily climbed onto the combine steps. Everything okay? That? Then why'd you stop? Daniel looked across the harvested stubble. Wanted to see it. She followed his gaze. So what happens next year? More wheat. Daniel reached into the compartment beside the seat and removed Henry's notebook. Inside it, he kept the faded receipt from the day he had walked into Ruth's store with $47. He no longer thought of that receipt as proof of how poor he had been. It reminded him of the day he finally accepted that he could not save every acre at once. He had only needed to save the first one, then learn from it. Daniel climbed down from the combine with Emily and walked several steps into the stubble. He crouched, pushed his fingers beneath the dry surface, and gathered a handful of soil. Emily waited. Would Daniel rub the earth between his fingers, checking the moisture underneath? Then he looked across Mercer Wheat Farm, not as something he had inherited finished, but as something he was responsible for adapting and passing forward alive. We'll see what the ground says.